Today we're going to do a brief overview about African American history or African American studies. This is a course that is growing more and more. High schools and universities are picking this up as a course to teach, an elective, and even some universities are now offering degrees in African American studies. So it's a great course. And before we talk about what African American history is, first I want to talk about why we learn in general, why we learn, why we go to school, why it's important to be educated. And let's start with this question. What is the number one problem in the world today? I want you to think about this for yourself. If you were asked this question on the street, what's the number one problem in the world today? What would you say? Well, here are some of the common responses I get. Some say poverty, others say violence, racism, hatred, disease, child abuse, broken homes, drug abuse, etc. These are all very real problems, big problems in the world today. But I believe one problem to be bigger because it is the foundation of so many other issues, and that would be ignorance. I believe most major problems in the world have an underlying cause called ignorance. Now, what is ignorance? Ignorance is a lack of knowledge, a lack of information, or a lack of wisdom. Now, notice it's not stupidity. Ignorance is not stupidity. Stupidity is when someone is unable to learn. Ignorance is when someone has not learned or maybe even won't learn. So it's not okay to stay in ignorance because it can cause so many problems. Look at the problems we listed above. So many of these can be caused by ignorance. For example, violence. If you don't know how to solve problems with your words, if you don't know how to control your emotions, then you're going to resort to violence. What about drug abuse? If you're not educated about what drugs do to your body and do to your mind, then you might be more inclined to abuse drugs. Racism. Most people who are racist are so out of ignorance because they simply don't understand that all people are equal and made in the image of God. So ignorance can cause a lot of issues, and that's why I believe it's the number one problem in the world today, because it's the root of so many other problems that are simply symptoms of this disease called ignorance. And really, that's why I became a teacher. That's why I think it's important to spread wisdom, to spread knowledge. That's why school is important, learning is important, because we all want to be less ignorant. We want to be less ignorant so that we can love other people better. Then we get to the subject of history. So we know why we learn in general, but why do we study history in particular? Why is it such a requirement in most schools to learn so much history? Well, first, it's important to learn history in order to learn from the past so we don't make the same mistakes as those who were before us. We are in a very privileged position in that we live at a time when we can look back in history and see the successes and the mistakes, the failures of billions of people who came before us that had similar challenges to what we face in our life today. Human nature hasn't changed in the past many thousands of years, and we can look to the past to see how other people dealt with problems so we know what examples to follow and what examples not to follow. This saves us from having to learn the lessons of history the hard way by experiencing them ourselves. Another reason we study history is to appreciate what we have and to appreciate where we and our ancestors came from. A sense of gratitude is necessary for a happy life, and if you don't know the history of what people had to go through in the past that we don't have to, then we might take what we have for granted. For example, indoor plumbing, running water, air conditioning, heating in the winter. All of those things are recent developments that help us live easier, more comfortable lives now than what humans used to live. So appreciating what we have now, that is something that history can help us do. Another reason we learn history is to honor the memory of those who came before us. We all live in a world that's built not by ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. And yes, the people of history were very flawed in a lot of ways. Human nature is flawed in a lot of ways. But they also helped build the world that we live in today. So to honor their memory and to appreciate what we have now, And then finally, we study history in order to better understand who we are. If you understand history, that helps the present make more sense. If you've ever been watching the news or scrolling through social media and you just get so confused, like, why is this the way it is? I mean, it doesn't have to be this way, right? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Well, if you know history, then you're able to better make sense of why things happen the way they do today. So that's why we study history. And next, why is Black history important to learn as Americans? And I mean all Americans, not just Black Americans, but why is it important to learn for all Americans? Well, first, it's important to learn in order to get us to better empathize with the suffering of those who came before us, and to ensure that such atrocities like slavery, segregation, and lynching never happen again. If we don't know Black history, then it's more likely that those things may resurface in the future. Second, it's important to learn Black history as Americans because it's good to learn about the accomplishments of African Americans of the past and present so we can honor them and follow their example. I think it's every bit as important to learn about the achievements of Black Americans as it is to learn about the suffering of Black Americans. And too often, the accomplishments very much get overshadowed. Third, Black history is important in order to learn the mistakes of those who came before us so that we can make better decisions, so we can improve and progress in the future. And then the fourth reason why Black history is important to learn as Americans is in order to better understand current issues, especially issues regarding race, and to be able to talk about facts and find solutions surrounding them so we're not just talking out of ignorance, making ourselves feel better. This way we can actually get to real solutions dealing with facts. So now we're going to do a little trivia to see how well you know Black history at this moment. So there's about 15 questions. Keep a tally of how many you get correct. It's just a brief overview of some of the big facts of Black history. And if you need to pause the video to think about each question for a while, you can do so. So the first question, what part of Africa did most slaves come to the New World from? North, south, east, or west? The answer is West Africa. If you look at the map there, most African slaves that came to the New World, that were forcibly taken to the New World, came from the west coast of Africa. Next, what percentage of slaves brought to the New World came to the modern-day United States? The answer is just 5%, which was surprising to me when I found out. But if you look at the map there, the vast majority of slaves taken from West Africa went to Brazil and to the Caribbean islands. Only about 5% went to the modern-day U.S. However, the slave population grew much faster and much larger in the United States because slaves had a longer life expectancy. They were treated much more harshly in the Caribbean and Brazil than they were in the United States, and therefore more babies were made and the population grew. Who was the leader of the movement that abolished the British slave trade? There's a person we don't talk about nearly enough, but definitely deserves our honor. William Wilberforce, really important guy, great person, accomplished something that was previously thought to be impossible. What political party was created in the U.S. in 1854 on the platform of abolishing slavery? The answer is the Republican Party. That was the issue it was founded upon. It was founded by people of several different political worldviews, liberal, conservative, both moderate, but all of them agreed on the platform that slavery needed to go. What was the main reason why the southern states seceded from the Union? There were 11 southern states that seceded, and the main reason why was to protect the institution of slavery. It is a myth that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It absolutely was. That's in the founding documents, the founding secession documents of the Confederacy, that they were leaving because they felt that their institution of slavery was under attack by Lincoln and the abolitionists and the Republicans in the North, and that's really why the war began. When were all slaves finally freed in America? What year? That would be 1865. So the Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863, but it wasn't until the war ended in 1865 that it applied to everyone. And then you have the Abolition Amendment, the 13th Amendment, also in 1865. And then finally on June 19th, 1865, the final slaves in Galveston, Texas, were notified of their emancipation. Hence we celebrate Juneteenth. Who was the first black U.S. congressman? His name was Hiram Revels. This was in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. Hiram Revels became a U.S. congressman representing Mississippi. And then in 1870, he became the first black senator representing Mississippi. And the very next year, Blanche K. Bruce, he became the second black U.S. senator, also representing Mississippi. So Mississippi had the first two black U.S. senators. Then unfortunately, Jim Crow came about and took away black people's right to vote, which they had for a short period of time after the Civil War, and then it was taken away. And then we didn't have another black senator until the 1960s. It took a very long hiatus there. In 1939, Hattie McDaniel became the first African American to win an Oscar, an Academy Award. What movie did she win it for? That would be Gone with the Wind. And this was a time when places were still segregated. So the big theater where the Oscars were being held, Hattie McDaniel was actually not even allowed in that building. She was back at her hotel, and she had to film her acceptance speech to be played in the all-white room. And she did so with grace, even though she had to endure that indignity. What division of the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II was entirely black? That would be the Tuskegee Airmen, or the Red Tails. Some called them the Red Tail Angels because they would never leave a man behind. What Southern preacher emerged as the leader of the civil rights movement during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955? It's a pretty easy one. That would be Martin Luther King Jr. There have been 3 black justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. How many of them can you name? Well, the first was Thurgood Marshall. He served from 1967 to 1991. The second is Clarence Thomas, who served from 1991 to the present. As of 2023, he's still on the court. And the third is Ketanji Brown Jackson, who became justice in 2022, and as of 2023, she is still on the court as well. There have been 2 black secretaries of state. Name one. Well, both of them were under the same president, George W. Bush. First was Colin Powell, who served during Bush's first term, 2001 to 2005. And then second was Condoleezza Rice, and she served during Bush's second term, 2005 to 2009. Who was the first surgeon to successfully separate conjoined twins at the head? That is Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson, the first surgeon ever, not just the first black surgeon, but the first surgeon to ever accomplish such a feat. 3 black coaches have won a World Series. Name one. Well, when I first started teaching African American studies back in 2020, there was only one black coach who had ever won a World Series, and now there are 3. So the first was Cito Gaston. He was the coach of the Toronto Blue Jays, and he won back-to-back World Series in 1992 and 93. And the second was Dave Roberts, who was and still is the coach of the LA Dodgers, and they won in 2020. Then Dusty Baker of the Houston Astros, they won in 2022. 2 black coaches have won a Super Bowl. Name one. The first was Tony Dungy in 2007, and the second was Mike Tomlin in 2009. When was Barack Obama president of the United States? Well, he won election in November of 2008, but when you are elected, you become president in January of the following year. So he was president from 2009 through 2017. And finally, there are currently 3 African Americans in the U.S. Senate. Name one. So as of 2023, the 3 black U.S. senators are Cory Booker, a Democrat from New Jersey, Raphael Warnock, a Democrat from Georgia, and Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina. So what we'll study in African American studies, in African American history, is first we're going to learn about African history. This is so that we can have a foundation of where most Black Americans' ancestors are from, and we're going to see similarities and differences between modern African history and modern American history. Then once we get that foundation, we will then learn about African American history starting in 1619 with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans and moving through the entire history of American slavery until its abolition in 1865. Then we are going to learn about post-emancipation African American history, so what happened after the Civil War from Reconstruction to the Jim Crow and segregation era, and also the great societal changes that finally came with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And finally, we're going to learn about African American history 1970 to the present. We're going to have special focus on Black excellence and Black accomplishments in the post-civil rights era. We're also going to discuss current controversial issues about race and the Black community in America today.